Now we're talking sacred geometry, which obviously has something to do with math. And I just really wasn't that great with math in school. So, is this something I'm going to be able to understand? I mean, is this math complicated?
Actually, it's the simplest form of math on the planet. Um, as children, as Jesus was quoted as saying, he goes, unless you have the mind of a child, you can't enter the kingdom of heaven. And so I took that in a literal sense, and I thought, well, obviously, no theory can be overly complex, or they would, or it's really not supposed to be something that we would normally use. Occam's razor suggests that simplest idea that is the solution is probably the best solution. So, as children, we start playing with circles, squares, triangles, and of course, during Christmas time, we're in class with our teachers and we're cutting out little patterns and we open it up and it makes a snowflake. So we're very familiar. Children play with these concepts all the time.
I did
Um,
that.
and because of that, I felt, well, I should be able to not use calculus, which I don't know, or any of the other higher mathematical principles. I also sucked at geometry. I loved math until I got to geometry. I got a very poor teacher. And proofs and theorems, it's like, why do I need to know that? There's like, well, physicists, if you're gonna, and it's like, well, I'm not gonna be a physicist, so obviously I don't need to know that. But as an architectural designer, using all of these shapes is quite important. So that's why I chose to look at whether or not you could create a unified model, a unified field model, really, using these most simplest shapes. And it just requires drawing a single circle, going around it a couple of times with these other circles that what I call the self-referenced seed as it describes itself, and then the square that comes out of it, got 2 or 3 different triangles that fit in there, and voila, you have all of the knowledge necessary to build the Giza Plateau Pyramid Complex. And what people don't realize is that even though the Great Pyramid itself is already been identified as using a unity model, nobody actually realizes that both the second and third pyramids also express, but just in a different way, a much subtler way, the same idea of unity in the same actual mathematical relationships, but they just came about it in a slightly different way. So from my point of view, it is truly the simplest form of math on the planet, and it only took someone deciding to actually look at the circle and how it refers to itself. That's the technique that will allow you to unfold what the ancients knew.
Sounds awesome. And this is in your book.
Absolutely. In fact, I don't want to call it a mathematical treatise because that just scares everybody away. But the truth of the matter is that by starting with a single circle and then just following how it can disclose information without any other information other than itself, how it discloses this square and discloses these other isosceles triangles that then square the circle. That's the term that's been coined, I don't even know how long ago, and that most people are familiar with that are actually studying this. So it's super easy. It's not complicated. It doesn't take, it takes a relatively high-minded individual to understand back then, because we're talking about not even having a written language that really was manifesting until around 3100 BC, about 600 years before credits given to the Fourth Dynasty builders of the pyramids. But I prove unequivocally that even at the very beginning of the dynastic age in around 3000 or 3100 BC, that the mastabas that were built there absolutely knew pi. And this is completely contrary to what is taught in college, because in college they use what they can actually see. They're not looking for hidden in plain sight knowledge. They're looking at what they can actually point at. And so the Rhind and Moscow mathematical papyri become the first representatives of knowledge of pi. And in actuality, the actual mastabas themselves prove to all of us that pi was known way back in the past. Now, I don't know how far back, because once you get past written language, everything becomes a oral tradition. But anytime there's a North Pole star, and not just point and go, oh, well, that spot up there, that's where the North Celestial Pole is. But when a star actually moves into that position, for about a year and a half, every night, all night long, you have the ability to make measurements from. And rather than the 20 seconds of measurements that other people like Bivol, when he points at other people's work and etc., he goes, well, you only get 20 seconds to actually come up with this alignment. So, how are you proving that it's the case? But actually, when Thuban was there in 2798 BC, we find that in actuality, you could measure at least the polar circumference of the Earth. And that is not a stretch, because while most people use the model of a sundial in order to basically go from a shadow from one side, shadow to the other, these mark these 2 points, you draw a line between the two where they meet in the center, then you project straight out at 90 degrees. Well, when you use that model, what you find is that your measurements literally deviate farther off center the farther away you go. And when it deviates like that, you have to actually, what you find is inaccuracies. It just keeps getting worse and worse. But when you have a North Pole star, which is farther away from anywhere else on the planet, which is higher than anything else on the planet, the reality of the situation is the farther away you go, the more accurate you become. That means that in a year and a half, you could literally walk the entire length of Egypt and measure it. And by measuring it, you can actually realize what the size of the Earth is, and that in fact it is actually a sphere and not a flat plane. Now, as far as why people thought the world was flat, I believe personally that, well, they're looking at maps, they're looking at squaring the circle model, and the map is flat. Therefore, the Earth is flat, because it's saying this is what the Earth is. I think it's just a completely mistranslation and misunderstanding. But this created some total confusion in what we call the Dark Ages. There's a couple of them, but and so Europe didn't actually realize the more deep components of mathematics and geometry until about the 1100s, when they got works that were held in place by Islam. They had saved a lot of the works from Plato and others, and we actually relearned from them. So from my point of view, simplest, easiest, could actually measure the Earth, don't need a alien to do it for us, but nonetheless, when you don't understand this level of reality, and you don't understand the simplicity of how an actual human being could actually figure this out, and you're left with an idea that something was built 13,000 years ago with no way to see a culture doing it, then what are you left with but to come up with these fanciful ideas that perhaps, a being from another galaxy or another star came and actually woke us up. It doesn't mean that a person from another galaxy or a different star didn't actually show up on the planet at some point. All I'm saying is it is not necessary. We could have done it on our own without any help from anybody else.
And you have been to the pyramids.
I've been there twice.
And I understand you're going again in May.
There's a very strong possibility of my going there in May.
And if we want to go with you, is that at all possible?
Yes, it is absolutely possible.
So we should watch your Facebook page for updates on that?
Yes, currently I only have a fan page, but the fan page is called Geopi Thai. Why Geopi Thai? Why was it called that? It was kind of me just being funny, and my wife jumped on it. We put it on there, it kind of stuck. But the idea of Geopi, or geometrically derived pi, is showing that by using what I call circular geometry, which is actually using compass and unmarked straight edge, that what that does is it creates an actual triangle whose half base to height essentially equals pi. It actually, in geometric terms, equals the square root of 2 plus the square root of 3, but when you add them together, it's 3.14623 ... So we could have easily known. Why scientists doesn't choose to recognize that, I really don't have a good reason to give you. I don't know why we have believed that we were unintelligent, and yet we can build things, moving 100-ton stone. But the idea from my point of view is, before you can build something, you have to design something. And so my work is essentially the architectural design of the most fundamental components that allowed them to lay out the Giza Plateau and lay out their measuring system, which was absolutely required. Now, the one thing I will say is that, interestingly enough, Baval, in his work, he suggested that the pyramids, he couldn't understand why the pyramids weren't in a straight line. But geometrically, it's quite easy to understand, because if you only have 1 point, you can build a circle of any size around it. If you have 2 points, you can do the same thing. If I've got 2 points, maybe the circle's only as big as between the 2 points, but I could literally make a circle as big as I want. But as soon as you have 3 points, and that's why there's 3 pyramids, it locks it into an absolutely definitive size. You can't deviate from it. It is literally locking it in place. And because of that, I can prove absolutely, geometrically and simply, that this represents a model that actually measures the Earth.
Thank you very much for giving us some time today, Mr. Goff. We're here in Sedona with Ty Goff, author of The Ancient World's Foundation Stone, Volume 1, Corrections to the Field.
You're welcome. Thank you for listening to me.